neurobehavioral basis of locomotion. So what do we know about the nervous system and its contribution to locomotor control? All right, so start with the definition. So how might you guys define locomotion?
Movement.
Movement. So is this locomotion?
Guess so, I'm not sure.
Okay.
Is it our ability to move our kind of entire body through space, either like forwards or backwards?
Yeah, so that's the key thing, right? Is that you're moving through space. So you can think of a locomotive or a train is moving through space. And the reason for this definition is that obviously there are different forms of locomotion. So we study walking, and you can also think of, again, as a locomotive where you have movement through your environment that's actually externally powered. You have a motor that's powering that movement. But of course, we're most interested in self-powered motion. So I also like to think about, what are the multiple ways that animals propel themselves through the environment. So what are some types of locomotion, aside from walking, that you might think about? Flying, running.
Driving.
So that's it's a form of locomotion. It's not self-powered, so we'll talk about self-powered forms. Hopping.
Yeah.
Swimming.
But I know for swimming, sometimes like the design of the animal is actually like evolved in context, so that it appreciates the environment, so it doesn't have to do it itself. Is that like...
So that's a huge area of research, and that's not particularly for swimming. It's actually all forms of locomotion.
Oh,
so and that has to do with how the mechanics of our bodies or animals' bodies, how mechanics and the control have evolved to account for the types of environments that we do.
Does gliding count as locomotion?
Gliding?
Yeah.
So like a sort of flying squirrel style, or
yeah,
birds when they are
instead of kind of flapping or like consciously moving a part of their body, they're taking advantage of the environment to keep them up.
Definitely, yeah. So they have to initiate that normally somehow, but it's a very energy efficient. Climbing, yes, moving from one place to another. Yeah. So there are many different styles. Brachiating, so that's essentially walking with the similar to walking with the arms. Skipping, biking is still self-powered, even though there's a machine involved. Crawling. So the reason to put all of these pictures up here is to think about what do these behaviors have in common. So other than the fact that you're moving yourself through the environment, what are some common?
Well, I was just going to think like a bird on an elephant. Is the bird moving? Is the bird in locomotion?
So the bird's in locomotion. It's not self-powered.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh, elephant powered. So what do these different styles of locomotion have in common?
They all have a brain driving.
Okay. There's a brain involved, so there's a control piece. What about the behavior itself, aside from the neural control?
Well, you're moving from one place to another. That's common moving.
And what about the style of movement? Can you think of anything that, if you think about walking or running, how might you describe those forms of locomotion?
Well, generally, it involves joints and muscles, and you need to be able to kind of move your limbs in a certain way in order to push them forward. Yeah,
so there's some regularity, and we can really think about. I like to think about three major features. These aren't exhaustive, but the primary feature that we often think about is rhythmicity. So with walking, hopping, running, there's a certain frequency that we adopt. So our legs move in what we call antiphase. So if one leg is swinging forward, generally the other one is going backwards. So this is important because when you have a rhythmic movement, as opposed to something that's really complex and changing over time, if you think about control, it's possible that these rhythmic patterns can be controlled by fairly simple circuits, as opposed to something that's really complicated, like maybe playing piano or learning to play piano or something where you really have to think about every movement. So, along with this property of being rhythmic, most forms of locomotion, at least once they're well trained, are quite automatic. And this is like the example that we just gave earlier about walking down the halls. You don't really think about taking each step. And this is extremely important, particularly, let's say you're walking across campus here, because you don't want to be thinking about, you're going to be walking, you're going to be texting or on the phone. There are people walking in different directions. There are bicycles, there are skateboards. And you can imagine that if you had to sort of consciously think about every step you take, it would be very difficult to move from point A to B across this campus without multiple collisions. So automaticity allows us to easily perform other tasks. And then the last feature, which we won't discuss too much today, is this issue of adaptability. And basically, adaptability is the property that allows us to move between different environments without making large changes in our control. And so an example of that in walking would be going from walking on the boardwalk in Santa Monica to walking on the beach. So now the surface is quite different, how the mechanics of the task have changed, but we fairly automatically adapt to those changes in the environment. And this adaptability is also quite important when we think about neurological disorders. Right? So people have had Parkinson's, or you have a stroke, or even if you have a musculoskeletal disorder, you hurt your knee. This adaptive capacity is what allows us to continue locomotion in spite of these challenges. So, at the sort of end of today, what we're really interested in understanding is how we can design interventions, right? So we want to improve walking function in individuals with PD, and we want to think about some principles that can guide the design of these interventions. So before we can move to the intervention end, we're going to cover discuss a little bit about the circuits, like the parts of the brain, parts of the nervous system that are responsible for controlling walking. We'll then think about, so generally, often we talk about control as sort of a top-down thing, right? I want my arms to move or my legs to move in a certain way, so how do I activate those muscles? But we also know that sensory information about the environment and your interaction with the environment is really important for modifying that control. So we'll discuss that. Review the sensory modalities, the types of senses that we have, and how they contribute to walking function. So we'll think a little bit about how damage to the nervous system influences walking ability. So along with what Dr. Petzinger discussed last week, we'll talk a little bit more about how areas of the brain and nervous system that have been shown to be damaged in individuals with PD, aside from the basal ganglia, which we commonly think about. And then finally, have some discussions about ways that we can maybe restore locomotor function. Okay, so to get into the neuroscience here, one of the main take-home points about walking is that the neural control, so how the whole nervous system controls walking, is organized in what we're going to call a hierarchy. So in other words, there are multiple levels of the nervous system involved in our control of walking. So at the the very end, the business end here, we have what we call our peripheral nerves. And so these are the nerves that both activate your muscles, so this is the actuation piece, but they also transmit sensory information about how you're interacting with the environment back to the central nervous system. So just generally, we can divide the nervous system into the peripheral nervous system, so all of these sort of collaterals that you see, and the central nervous system, which includes the brain, the brainstem, and the spinal cord. So as we move up the hierarchy, most of the research in understanding the neural control of walking, believe it or not, has focused on the spinal cord. So again, because we talked about this property of locomotion that's typically rhythmic, rhythmic motions can be controlled by very simple circuits. So you might as well put those circuits close to the actuators or overlays. There's not necessarily a need for them to be involved in the more sort of complex structure of the brain. So we'll spend a decent amount of time talking about what we know about the spinal control of locomotion. Then moving up one additional level, we can now start thinking about the brainstem. And this is going to become more important as we discuss issues related to PD and some of those depths of stuff that we observe in that population. So the brainstem is another one of these, actually I'll step back a little bit. One of the, I think, most important things to realize about the nervous system is that there are many loops, many different feedback loops. So there are, the spinal cord sends information to the brain communicates with the spinal cord sends information to the muscles, and so on. At any given level, there are projections in multiple directions. And then once we get to the brain, it becomes even more complicated and confusing because many different regions of the brain project to each other. So this is one of the primary challenges of neuroscience is how do you understand circuit function in this really complex system. And so finally, we'll talk about the cortex. So this is roughly what we often think about when people say the brain. But we'll talk about a couple of specific areas of the cortex, which are the outer layers of the brain, to be more precise, and the role of those areas during walking. So, when we think about the role of the spinal cord in its control over locomotion, if you look at any literature or a book, a neuroscience book on walking, the first sentence or paragraph that you read about will say something about central pattern generators. So these are typically abbreviated CPGs, but they're basically circuits within the spinal cord that are capable of generating rhythmic activity. So, within the field of neuroscience, a lot of our knowledge, stems from work that was done in animal models and eventually expanded to humans. So some early studies looking at the control of CPGs would focus on simple animal models because they are tractable. Right? So this is an example of the leech. I actually just saw there was a talk here yesterday in mechanical engineering of someone who basically models the nervous system of the leech and how it controls swimming. But essentially, you can map all the neurons in this animal. So you know all the connections in the whole nervous system. That's essentially impossible in humans. But because you can map these connections, you can also look at what happens when you delete certain neurons to understand the whole network's function. And so what we're looking at here is just a sort of a cartoon of the leech's nerve. I think this is called the neural cord, I believe. There are muscles on each side of the leech. And then along each segment of the leech, you have these different ganglia or groups of neurons. And basically what you find is you see results for both the leech and the lamprey here, is that as you move from the front of the animal toward the back, so this anterior to posterior, you essentially see that the activity of these neurons follows that progression. So these neurons act in an oscillatory fashion, and they are what controls this undulating motion of the leech. So I saw a cool video yesterday from the guy who gave this lecture, but I don't have that video. But essentially, the leech is just making a wave, a sine wave, to move through the water. And so if you dig a little bit deeper into this literature, what you'll often find are these types of figures, which basically talk about how different parts of this central pattern generator connect to one another. The main take-home point from this section here is that you have this circuit, so what's inside the green boxes is basically the spinal cord, and these circuits receive sensory input from the environment, as well as descending input from the brain and other sensors. So they're not completely independent of the rest of the body.
Is it, does electrical stimulation cause the movement? So contracting and expanding based on electrical stimulation of a muscle?
Exactly. So the way that muscles work in essentially all animals that I'm aware of is you have neurons that project to those muscles. Those neurons send essentially electrical signals, and at the muscle level, what happens is you get calcium that comes into the muscle, and that will trigger a sequence of events to cause a contraction. So people call that excitation, which is the neural part, contraction, coupling, to describe the process.
Okay, so how does the signal get then back to the spinal cord? Does it also go through a reverse calcium? I mean, what's sort of sensing that and sending it back to the spinal cord?
Yeah, so let's see.
What you need?
A board and is that possible?
Do you want me
Or should I just
to
lift it?
raise it? Yeah, I'll raise it, and then we'll erase the back, and you can. You'll see
Oh,
something
you guys had
very.
a good talk last week.
No.
We're done.
We did last week. Yeah, this
That was last week.
Is a top-down lecture.
Uh-huh.
All right. So
This was Giselle?
yes.
Okay. You guys are neuroscientists already.
Sure.
Officially.
Starting like to play with it.
This is good. So then, yeah, so let's make this easier.
Hearing it again would be great because none of us here are.
Yeah, so just as an aside, so when I was in graduate school, I was working on this topic of neuromechanics, and this was at Northwestern. It just so happens that in our department, the neuroscience sort of started from the spinal cord and worked its way up. So some of the most well-known neuroscientists who studied spinal physiology were at Northwestern, so that's most of my expertise. Then I moved to Baltimore at Johns Hopkins, where it's top down. So no one understands the spinal cord, but everybody understands the brain. So I float in between now. So okay. So spinal cord. See something like this. So this is a cross section of the spinal cord. This will be a muscle.
Can you use a darker one because that one's pretty.
There's some in here.
Yeah. Is that one? Okay. Good.
This would be a muscle in the leg. So you typically have some muscle fibers. Within the muscle, you have a set of sensors. So we call these spindles. So this sensor basically communicates back to the spinal cord. So in the spinal cord, you might have a neuron here. That neuron is going to project to the muscle. The muscle might contract, and then sensory, we call these efferent, and sensory afferents come back here. So this is what we call a closed loop of the spinal cord and muscle.
But how does that spindle and the afferent signal, how does it sort of let the spinal cord know? Maybe it has to go up to the brain if the terrain is uneven, or if the belts are running at different speeds, or if it's hot.
Yeah, so
You're on the sand.
this is just an example of one actor.
Right.
So the muscle spindle senses the length of the muscle and the velocity. So if you go to the go to your doctor's office and you're sitting on the table and you do a tendon tap,
Right.
you kick, right? So you
Right.
get this. It's called the patellar tendon reflex. All that is when they tap your patellar tendon, they're stretching a spindle in your the tie, that information is traveling to your spinal cord, just like this. And so you do this accurately. The cell body is here, comes into the spinal cord, and projects right back. So now this muscle is stretched. The muscle says, hey, spinal cord, I'm stretched. I want to go back to where I was before. This is called negative feedback. And so now the nervous system says, okay, contract that muscle to extend it. So that's exactly what happens when you get the tipping tap.
I mean, are they all vertical or are they different? Are they sort of in vectors?
Yeah, so these are aligned with the muscle. So
Oh, they are,
because
okay.
your muscle can only contract, so that you get very little of sort of this movement and basically nothing like this, because there's the bone that constrains the muscle.
But then does the brain make sense of that, or does the spinal cord automatically react?
So we'll talk about
Okay.
that. That's a good question.
Yeah.
Yeah, so what I found really interesting about the spinal cord when I was in graduate school is that this part of the body that we kind of ignore can do really complicated things. And so what I like to say is that essentially both the brain and the spinal cord are just networks of neurons. So there's really nothing that makes the brain look better or more capable than the spinal cord, because they're made up of the same thing. So yeah, there's a whole body of literature related to how complex behaviors that can be controlled at the spinal cord.
I know that like sometimes there's a prejudice to only, I think what you alluded to, only look at the brain for like the answers for questions like cognitive. So would you, for there's the terminologies of like having a brain-based vision where everything's about the brain versus kind of the extended cognition where it's throughout the entire body or perhaps includes the environment. So is this work or is your work more less about the brain, or like would you subscribe to the idea of, hey, we should probably not focus on the brain? Or?
So this is why I use the term neuromechanics, because in the work that I do related to movement, the role of the brain is on, or the nervous system, not even focus on the brain, the role of the nervous system is really only understood in the context of behavior. And those behaviors have to deal with physics. So my limbs have some mass. If I want to, I'm standing on the ground, so I'm interacting with the environment. And so you have to really understand the whole, try to understand the whole picture together oftentimes. It's hard to do those things in isolation. So that's how I try to approach the problem, but it's just a very difficult problem. And so as scientists, of course, we end up sort of reducing the problem in different ways to make it tractable, and then you hope that that informs the bigger picture. So it's sort of zooming in, zooming out at different levels constantly.
Do you want the screen down now?
Yes. All right, so again, so we showed evidence of these CPGs in invertebrates, but there's a lot of work looking at evidence for the spinal control of locomotion in mammals. And most of this is focused on cats. So the typical experiment, so people use what's called a spinalized cat preparation. And essentially what happens is you transect the spinal cord. So what you're doing here is that you have nerves in the spinal cord that project to the legs or the hind limbs in the cat. And you sort of disconnect the brain and the brainstem from those hind limbs. And what they have shown in these studies is that when you can put a spinalized cat on a treadmill, start the treadmill, and the cat will walk. So there's no information from the brain. There's nothing traveling up to the brain, nothing coming back. So just from the sensory information that's related to the treadmill and the movement of the limb, you can get cyclic motion, so an actual walking.
Is it like chicken cut off?
It's essentially the same thing. So this is just a cat on a treadmill. Just so you can see. Oh, that looks. So this is an animal walking on a treadmill. You can see here the speed of the treadmill. And what they're going to do here is gradually increase the speed. And so, again, the only information that's coming into the nervous system is from the environment. And now you can see that as the speed is increased, the behavior matches that change in speed. So there's sort of intelligence built into the spinal cord, if you think about, or if you consider sort of changes based on the environment to be some measure of sort of intelligence.
But if you cut off on the brain, then now we can assume that maybe the spinal cord still controls the nervous system. But what about just thinking, like Leach's Leach example, this nervous system itself is reacting. How do you differentiate?
So say it again. So are you asking about what is the brain's role in the whole system?
We hear that you cut off the brain part, so it's obvious, right? It doesn't affect. So spinal cord is still attached to the rest of the body. So the spinal cord controls the locomotion, right? But then how do you know that spinal cord controls versus, like, say, as example we saw in Leach, that it has a kind of automated locomotion of muscles themselves. So how do you locate that is the spinal cord control?
Right. So in the Leach example, they've done the same experiments where, again, just the spinal cord or the equivalent of the spinal cord in the Leach can cause this cyclic swimming motion. But I think a related question is whether in an intact animal, if the spinal cord is doing the same thing. That's a much harder question to answer.
Okay, so it answers that.
So there are two questions, maybe related, but what would this gait look like compared to a normal cat? In other words, would they be walking the same way?
Yeah.
And the second thing would be, if you made this much faster, would it run?
First question is, how does this compare to normal walking?
Because it looks like an odd walking. It looks like it's letting the foot go all the way to the back till it sort of can't.
So what you can notice if you just look at the left hind limb is that you have toe drag.
Yeah.
Right? So it's
There's a dependency on the physics because there's no other feedback.
Well, yeah, there's some other
Yeah.
other details.
The muscle
about the
itself is
experiment
probably
I've tried to
stretching
ignore.
out to a certain
Okay.
The
point.
reality is there are a couple things. One, they're supporting the cat.
Yeah.
Someone's holding it. You can see the hand.
Oh, I
there.
see.
The other thing is that there's a lot of evidence, mostly in humans, actually in lots of vertebrates, that so the muscles that lift the toe. So if you just sit at your chair and lift your toe, or if you have the muscle in your shin, those seem to have a much larger control from the brain as opposed to the lower levels. So this may be an example of that when you remove the input from the brain, you get what we call someone in pathological gait, you talk about toe drag. So when people have a stroke and the brain is damaged, that's one of the first things that you see.
Oh, I see.
Toe drop.
Yes. Those,
Oh, I see.
the brain is the spinal cord in humans may be better utilized to do things like extension, maintain anti-gravity support, but not so much flexion. So you need the brain for that.
Plus, that could cause tripping.
Exactly.
So so you can puppet the body, which is kind of what's happening there. But to have elegant fluid motion, you need the brain.
In the brain, right?
So that's something that is often ignored in this literature. People in this literature, if you just read enough of these papers, they can think that the implicit argument is that the spinal cord is good enough, or that walking is controlled by the spinal cord. That's not what's happening. You take this animal off the treadmill, they're not walking.
So should we be thinking the spinal cord is responsible for this, or like is it actively affecting this, or is this walking just a long-term reflex?
So I'm going to answer two questions here at once. So the first question was your earlier question about what happens as you speed up the treadmill. So, what they've done here, so this is an example of a cat. Here you can see they're running on a treadmill or walking.
Different kind of popular cat videos.
Yes,
Today.
this is neuroscience. So you can see that this animal is moving from I guess that's a trot,
Right.
alternating.
Right.
And eventually, if you look at the hind limbs, eventually gallop. That's now. So
And this cat was transected.
So the
Transected,
key
though?
here is that in this cat, or in this population of studies, what they tend to do is something called decerebration. So we talked about the spinal cord, but if you transect at higher levels where the brain stem is intact, then these studies have basically shown that specific regions of the brain stem will allow the animal to do this transition.
Wow.
So transition from trotting to galloping. So I think the unfortunate reality of neuroscience is that most of what we know about the brain and nervous system come from lesion studies, whether in humans or in cats. So when you remove an area of the nervous system to try and infer what that part is, it's not crystal clear, but it's historically the way that things have transitioned. So then the second question was related to, are these just a bunch of reflexes? So, so the way that neuroscientists, this was about 100 years ago actually, tried to answer this question is if I look at the spinal cord, you have what are called dorsal and ventral roots. So you can think about the dorsum as back, ventral as front, right on front head. So most of the sensory information from the muscles comes through the dorsal roots. Just like we talked about in previous studies, if you're a neuroscientist, early 1900s or up to 2000s, if you want to understand the contribution of something, you remove it through some lesion. And so what they did here was to actually transect the dorsal roots. So you prevent sensory information from coming to the spinal cord. And forget how they stimulated behavior. Let's see. I believe what they did here was that the animal, so this is time moving in this direction. The spinalized animal is walking here. And then at some point during that motion, you transect, or no, this might be the dorsal root. So you basically transect the dorsal root. So once the system is going, you prevent sensory information from coming in, and you see that rhythmicity is maintained for some period of time. There are more elegant studies, but the take-home point is that you can see this rhythmic activity in the spinal cord without sensory information. So it's an intrinsic, what we call an intrinsic property of those circuits. All right. So
So would that mean that just the nervous reactions, just automated like nervous function? Is that what you're saying without any sensory input?
yeah, basically. All right. So with this guy, so let's say I take the neurons, these circles, and I eliminate the purple. So that's transecting the dorsal roots. I spinalize the animal, so I remove the descending part. So now I just have a bunch of neurons that are connected. If you somehow activate one of these neurons, that sort of jumpstarts. It's like you have the paddles and shock the system, and it starts to oscillate. And it just continues doing that simply because of the properties of the neurons and the connections. So you can simulate this fairly easily.
So then the question would be, what happens if you transect the other one? So that the brain is still getting sensory input, but the spinal cord can't send a signal to the leg. What happens then? Does the brain override the spinal cord? Does the brain override the spinal cord?
So I don't know exactly how you would do that, because then you can't control what the brain is sending.
Oh,
As the animals make a decision.
Right.
that it wants to stop. And that's
Oh, I see.
what we tend to do.
Oh.
Yeah, so there are, you could talk about this area of research for days, but I
That's
think
very interesting.
you understand the main points.
Mhm.
So we spent a lot of time basically arguing that you can see some of these behaviors in the absence of sensory input, but we know that in reality, of course, that's not what we do. So when we talk about the sensory system, there are, I say three. I should have also put the auditory, but there are three major systems that we think about with respect to the neural control of thought. So the first is what we call somatosensory. So soma is basically body. So this is the part of the nervous system that gives us information about our own body. These are sensors, or I say sensor because I'm an engineer, but these are things like if you tickle someone, right? The reason that you perceive that as being ticklish is that there are sensors in your skin that are communicating information about vibration and touch back to your brain. We already talked about spindles, which communicate information about muscle length and stretch. There are other sensors that communicate information about different aspects of the body as well. The second major system is the vestibular system. So you'll typically, colloquially, talk about the inner ear. So this is the part of the peripheral nervous system that gives us information about, it's actually information about the head, to be specific. And I won't talk too much about this, but this is actually how I got into, indirectly how I got into VR. Because if you're ever sitting in a car, you're sort of pulling into a parking spot, and the person beside you pulls out, you feel like you are moving forward really fast. So this is sort of oculo, related to basically the interaction between the vestibular system and vision. So vestibular information and visual information are tightly coupled in the perception of movement as well as the generation. But just so quickly, the vestibular system is responsible for giving us that sense of self-motion, both of these combined. And the actual inner ear, how many of you have heard of IMUs, or inertial measurement units? Have you heard of this term? So these are basically, if you get your phone and you play any of these games and where you tilt your phone, that's what your phone has, those sensors built into it. They respond to orientation and velocity.
What are they called again?
Inertial
Measurement units. And I find this amazing. That's
what's
literally
in here.
exactly what the vestibular system gives you. It's head orientation relative to gravity, and then velocity. Guess what? So I read this once, and it's essentially a way to sort of understand how the system works. You can essentially make yourself extremely sick very fast. Mm-hmm. And I believe what you do, don't try this, you didn't hear it from me, but you basically hold your head down so that your vestibular system recalibrates gravity, and then you start spinning. And you get to the point where you're spinning at a constant speed. That's the key. Because once you're at a constant speed, then the system stops sending information. So it's about changes. And so you're doing that, spinning at a constant speed. But then when you raise your head, literally the whole world starts spinning in multiple directions.
Is it because of that when suppose a car is moving and when we look down, sometimes it's like, and suppose we're reading, sometimes we start feeling nauseous.
Yeah, so you're doing, there are a lot of things going on.
Yeah, because the motion of the head or the motion of the car, it kind of does not match. Or
yes, so in VR, this is a huge issue. So
yes.
If the motion of your body does not match what you're perceiving visually, that's one way that you can get simulator sickness. So understanding these systems, I think, is very important if you're interested in VR, particularly for any type of simulation that has a lot of motion. see.
Cats.
Yeah. Cats.
Does anyone put a VR headset on their
Hmm.
Have you?
head? Very tempted,
So I'm just
but
gonna.
their up close vision is terrible. So for reasons. Cats are basically practically blind 3 inches from their face.
Skip ahead a couple slides.
Can I ask you about the last slide? So is it possible to sort of mimic the vestibular system with some cognitive effort, with some visual effort? So for example, let's say you had an impaired vestibular system. Now, vision can help you by itself, but can you now train your vision to make it sort of super, vision that will take care of the lack of vestibular system? Or the somatosensory system.
Physical therapists here who could answer that question.
Yeah, I don't know. I'm just wondering if it. That's it. I just wonder if it's cognitive or if it has to do with these things. Because I know as we get older, we start to lose somatosensory, sensitivity, and now we have to rely more on the other systems, and that's why we fall more than.
Yeah, it's again a complicated answer. The real answer is complicated beyond what I know, but you can have what's called sensory relay. So, personal example, I sprained my ankle like 6 or 7 weeks ago. When I was in high school, I sprained it frequently. So I had terrible proprioception at the end of my ankles. So I work in a PT department, fortunately, so I just went into the clinic. I said, hey, Brian, what's going on? He said, oh, how can you stand on one foot? Sure, I can do that. As soon as I close my eyes, I basically fall. So my body is very bad at using information from the feet or from the legs for balance. I'm visually
Right.
Other people, not so much.
Right.
So, and you can train these things to a certain extent. But if you lose one, you can't replace it.
I was thinking more for purposes of how you could do interventions with VR, because VR is very visual.
So the PTs and ENT program, which fit people that have cochlear implants or they have hearing loss, they do a lot of walking rehabilitation and sort of sensory recovery. But I think they do it really by practice. So you can learn to rely on different sensory information that's whatever you get from even just the bottom of your foot, learn to recalibrate.
And then progression with head turning, walking and head turning, and so there's a whole series of events.
And in VR, we can make you feel that way because VR essentially is a black box when you start it, right? So you can have people relearn how to walk as if they're blind if you show them nothing, right? And then you can cue their walking through sound and see what that feels like, or through, vibration, a lot of different stuff you can do with it, and people have done that for many years experimentally. But it's not being used in clinical practice. Experimentally, we can do whatever you want, but you're not going to go to your doctor now and find a treatment that uses that off the shelf. That's why you're all here.
Yeah. So since we're waiting, there's one other thing I was going to get back. Okay, so skip ahead here. This gets back to an earlier question about kind of the capacity of the spinal cord. So I won't even bring up the text here. I think this figure is really interesting. The first thing to understand is that this is a stick figure that's taken from its motion capture data, or maybe just a camera that was digitized, or images that were digitized. A cat is walking on it. Call this a treadmill, or this would be overground actually. And forward is to your left. So this is a typical trajectory. So the leg moves back, or the body moves forward relative to the foot. You then pick up the foot and place it down. So you pick up the foot, that's called swing, and you put it down, you then stand. So pretty typical. Now, if I, let's say, reach out and touch the top of the foot, call this a cutaneous stimulus, what would you expect to do, right? If you are moving and you touch something, how might you recover from that trigger? What would you do with your leg?
Or you like that? Or lift
Pull
it.
your leg up and then continue to go. So that's what you see here. So pull your leg up and then once again. This, again, is a spinalized animal. So this reflex or this behavior is just embedded within the spinal cord. So you don't need a brain to do this. So conversely, if I'm swinging and somebody touches the back of my foot, I don't really need to do anything. They're not really perturbing my motion. So nothing happens. Now, if you ask the animal to walk backward, so what you would want to do is basically reverse those two behaviors. Now, if you touch the back of my heel, I should flex the leg and then avoid the obstacle. And that's what you see here. So the spinal cord is both encoding, it's taking in information about the direction of movement, how the body is receiving sensory information, and then it's adjusting the response accordingly. So these are intelligent responses to perturbations. So I think it's important to understand. There's a lot of work in this area looking at what the spinal cord is capable of. So that's enough spinal cord.
Can I ask a very strange question? So, it says that spinal cord triggers intelligence that controls this kind of automated responses, right? So, hypothesis, like say when we do meditate, like we try to calm down our system to have certain, mental or whatever that could be, but we think that's brain concentration, right? So in this case, that you could walk do some automated action that is only controlled by spinal cord, and then get same kind of brain concentration, like meditation, right? Would that be possible?
So in a sense, I guess the way that I'm interpreting your question is we're thinking about reducing the cognitive contribution to the behavior, to just maybe behavior in general, so through meditation, and relying more on these lower level controls. Is that related? Is that your question? Can you do that?
Yeah.
Possibly, I'm not quite sure. A lot of this, at least at the spinal level, it's fairly rigid. Right? It's embedded in the system, and it's going to happen regardless of what the brain is doing. All right, so just sorry,
Can you just go back one slide? This is the
which is this?
if that's possible. Yeah, just so the spinal cord generates intelligent functional responses. Okay. So what would be an intelligent functional response? Just any of those things?
I say what would be sort of a naive response. The naive response, well, one would be if you stimulate my toe, I just continue to do what I was doing. Right? So basically I'm stumbling, but I try to pull my leg through the obstacle. That would be a useless. No, you would have a lack of a response there.
I don't know if this is helpful, but is it seemingly intelligent, or is it just the reflex, or is there some agency behind this? Or?
Yeah, so that gets more into the philosophy of neuroscience than I tend to go. But essentially, the nervous system are a bunch of neurons that are connected to one another. There have been questions for hundreds of years about what causality, right? Because this is you could call it a reflex. There was a perturbation, and then you got this behavior. There's no brain, so there was no conscious decision. Most people would be comfortable calling that a reflex.
It just seems as sure as a rock would roll down a hill. So that's why it just seems like it shouldn't be intelligent. It should be seemingly intelligent. But I mean, of course, this is semantics, but I just didn't understand what you meant, so that's why I'm asking.
It is interesting though for PD and automaticity, right? Because depending on the lens through which you're looking at a problem, having automaticity is essential for walking, and yet having mindless walking without any kind of processing of stuff will make you robotic and fall into stuff. Like it's like being able to adapt. You're able to adapt if you're
Adaptable.
just doing what you know without being flexible to the context changing. So that's why I don't like the conscious versus subconscious, and even the concept of reflex implies thoughtless. But you know, it might be, we obviously transition as we learn to walk, right? So you have to think early in the baby pictures that you showed that you transition from something being very effortful initially to something very effortless. That you don't have to think about it, but that is a learned thing to not have to think about it.
Yeah, I think that's probably the key.
Yeah.
Is that these things happen without having to allocate resources to it.
Yes.
So I can be thinking about what I'm doing or having for dinner, and this is going to happen.
Yeah.
So it's really that's the intelligent part of it, I think.
Right. So yes, it basically helps. You're more efficient, right? It's a more efficient use of neural resources. When you're walking and you trip, by the time you realize that you tripped, you've already recovered. So it's, a smart system has things like that embedded. I hate to sort of go on tangents, but so I also collaborate with people in computer science who do develop controllers for walking robots. And this is a really hard problem. So if I have a robot and my robot trips, there aren't very good strategies to recover from that. You can watch videos of robots fall because it's really hard.
Can I ask the question a slightly different way? Does the spinal cord learn?
Yes.
Or is it just automatically that's the way you're born with the connections that you have? So it actually learns,
You're born with self, but not the connections.
but growing connections is learning, or so the spinal cord itself doesn't learn.
It does.
It does? So how does the
is
spinal cord learn?
We'll talk about
Yeah,
plasticity, but learning
without the brain, I'm
basically-
saying, is it?
So
That's
the way that I
amazing.
think about learning, I think it's consistent with what you're saying,
Yeah.
is that learning is basically the strength of connections and then what's connected to it. So if you forget about the issue of cognition and being
Right.
aware of something,
Right.
at the basis, the physical basis, it's connections and the strength of those connections. If you have a system where you can change those things, and those changes are somewhat long lasting.
So it's sort of related to what we learned last week about the automaticity. It has to do with the
Absolutely.
connections.
So I think you have to get out of the metaphysics of learning as thinking of it as a highly conscious process. Because
Right.
you can have someone who has no concept of otherness.
Right.
They're still learning. They're still making connections.
Right.
So
Right.
that consciousness is not required for learning at the neuroscience level definition of it. Okay.
Right.
So you can argue it.
Well, that's very interesting.
That's a tough statement you just said.
Especially for somebody whose philosophy
It
of
is, because in
mind.
robotics, right? Does learning not take place? It's not perhaps the same as human learning, but if you define a concept of learning as making new connections, right? And accumulating, like building on top of that, right? Becoming better at a skill. So if you just deal with it as a skill position, then human versus not human does not matter.
Or just whether or not conscious agency actually plays a role.
That's a different
that's
story.
Well, would we say a tree learns because like it
Does a
grows
baby have
towards the sun?
agency? Babies are fairly mindless early on.
I never thought of it that way.
I think these
They grow towards the sun.
you have to come to a consensus on the definition of learning before you can actually have these conversations.
Exactly.
Otherwise, it will continue to go back and forth.
In case of robots, that's what we call artificial intelligence, right? that's the process of learning artificially. It's not like neural connections, but it's Robo is also making connections between the data we feed in it.
Yeah, so typically, when you're talking about learning, I think the most common definition of that is developing an input-output relationship. So given some information, you transform that information into something else. And so you can do that artificially, you can do that with animal that has agency. That's largely what you're doing.
I have a question.
So, yeah, good question.
Yeah. Have they tried to do studies where they take very young cats that haven't yet really learned how to walk on their own and see what happens if the spinal cord can kind of yeah, what happens? Can it learn, or
Yes.
does
So,
the brain need to be?
The problem is that most of these animals are born knowing how to walk. So
Right.
walking is embedded during the process of development in utero. Animals born
Yeah.
and then so humans are very different.
So you would need something like maybe a horse foal, I guess, that takes
What?
a foal, like a baby horse, that has a sort of learning time period.
Even there, it's really short.
Yeah.
It's maybe minutes. So I'm gonna have to sort of speed ahead here so that we can move forward. Let's see what should we.
Can you
Okay.
write your question down?
Oh, yeah.
So this is going to be a bit of a trust me section here so that we can move forward. But we talked about the spinal cord. I think it's amazing, and I can talk about it for hours. But there are other supraspinal regions that are extremely important for locomotion. And my way that I divide these systems is that part of this supraspinal system, we already talked about the brainstem, that it has been shown to be very involved in triggering the onset of locomotion. So when you think about starting a behavior, gait initiation, that can be very problematic in people, as well as doing that sort of speed-based change in coordination. So just like we saw with the cat, going from trotting to galloping, that can be controlled by the brainstem. Then another part of this supraspinal system is important for refining our pattern. So largely this is related to the cerebellum, where this part of the brain receives information from the spinal cord, so about what's going on in the environment. And then it also receives information from the cortex about commands that are being sent, and can kind of integrate this information to send adjustments roughly to the spinal cord. And then, of course, if our movements, there are changes in the environment, we have to be able to sense those. Often, for most of us, we do that visually, and that relies, of course, on pathways that travel through the cortex. So, these are the three main functions of the supraspinal control, and this is important because there's evidence that sort of each of these can be impaired in Parkinson's. So without going to the skipping the sort of animal evidence that
More people stuff.
more people.
More people stuff.
Yeah, so we just go with that. Okay. So this is where I'll have Beth chime in here. So you guys talked a bit about. Did you guys talk about like motor dysfunction in Parkinson's last week?
A little bit,
Okay.
yes.
So what I find really interesting about PD and treatments for PD is that you tend to have symptoms that are responsive to dopamine replacement. And so you give people dopamine replacement therapies or other types of pharmacological treatments, and this is from a review that you guys can find here. But there are certain aspects of the motor dysfunction observed in PD that at least early on in the disease, are responsive to dopamine replacement. And again, this review, these are just a list of those things. However, there are a couple of things that are not responsive or that actually develop as a result of extended use of these therapies. And so the main two that I'll talk about here are that, in individuals who have PD, there's an increased prevalence of falls relative to health aimed match controls. And of course, what most people think about in PD is freezing of gait. It's not, I don't think it's as prevalent as people seem to make it out to be. All right. So, so from this review cited a couple of studies that report the incidence of falls in Parkinson's, and a longitudinal study of a number of individuals with PD. More than half of them, and about 2/3 of them, fell at least once over the course of the year. For those people who did fall, I believe this was also within a year, there was about half of them had subsequent falls or recurrent falls. So if you fall once, you're likely to fall again. And if you compare the mortality rate of fallers versus non-fallers, we know that both in Parkinson's as well as elderly, once you fall, particularly if you have kind of musculoskeletal damage, that can rapidly increase the likelihood of mortality. So the question is sort of, why do people fall? And this is, I'm maybe simplifying the question as much as possible, and the answer as much as possible here. So if you think about a fall, you can have a fall because sometimes we're walking and we just trip. Right? So nothing happened in the environment. We just stumbled. So really, that is an internal problem. We, for some reason, the nervous system, we didn't lift our toe high enough or something along those lines. So that's an internally triggered stumble or trip. But you can also have falls, of course, that result from interactions with the environment. And in PD, there's varying degrees of evidence that these individuals have impairments in proprioception, so the body sense.
So does everyone here know what proprioception is?
Who doesn't? Yeah. Okay.
There you go.
So proprio, I believe, is maybe Latin for one's own. So this is sensation of one's own body. So I talked about somatosensation. These are very much, there's some differences here. Yeah, so proprioception is largely related to your sense of body configuration and movement. So this is mediated largely by sensors in your muscles and your tendons and your joints and your skin. Whereas again, vestibular sense is that inner ear sense.
Let me be a little more specific for them. So now you know that you're holding something because you can feel it, right? There's a lot of information. That's a different kind of system than when you move your arm. You know, like how you're moving it because there's feedback back from your body to your body, which is more related to perception versus touching stuff and seeing stuff, right? Different kind of.
Yeah, that's a good point, and it can be confusing because the sensors in my skin can tell me things about the environment, right, the table, but the same sensors can also tell me about my own movement. So proprioception is not so much about the sensors as it is about telling you about your own movement. So I think that's a key distinction. All right. So the conditions under which falls tend to happen or are more common are when people do things like turning or doing secondary tasks or thinking about things or trying to do some sort of secondary motor task with the upper limb.
Specific, like obstacle avoidance.
Yep, so that's, I think we'll say that on the next slide, actually.
Okay.
So a lot of the triggers for falls are similar to triggers for freezing. And there's an interesting paper here where, if you think about falling, we don't often think about how do you protect yourself when you fall. So if I trip and I can't recover with my legs, then I'm going to put my arms out to break the fall. There's some evidence that
You might see that in action if you keep walking backwards.
I can't help that. At least it lets me know where I am. But yeah, so there's some evidence that there may be an increased likelihood of injury from falls in PD because they lack the appropriate responses in the upper extremities. So again, it's a complex issue.
Secondary cognitive tasks, like.
Yeah. So here we basically mean you're cognitive. You're sort of walking and doing.
else.
So let's say we do walking and texting. So the texting would be the secondary. You can think about that as a secondary task of walking.
You think the statistics would be any different if it was banging into things as opposed to falling?
Are they more or less likely to run into objects versus fall?
In other words, would they be some percentage more likely to walk into something like a door or something that was jutting out, and then do it?
That's a good.
No. Okay.
So that's more of a how aware are you about your environment? Is that
Right. Well, it's sort of, yeah.
So you would see that in like neglect.
Yeah.
Somebody's like stroke.
Right.
It's like with some kind of visual impairment or visual perception.
Yeah.
Or visual perception and deficits, but not associated with actually visually tracking an object or something.
You were talking about walking into obstacles, that they have trouble
Navigating around obstacles.
navigating around obstacles.
Yes.
That's
So
what I was
stuff-
sort of.
navigating around stuff on the floor. So if I put this in front and I have to go around it, I'm just going to do this. But someone with an impairment is going to go around it. But that's different than me running into this because I didn't pay attention to it.
Right.
It's kind of a different thing because there's a difference in how you perceive it, in what system you use to kind of go around it.
Mhm.
It's overlap, but it's not exactly the same.
But running into things can be a proprioception issue, right?
Yes.
Especially in like children. Children that frequently like run into things, bump into things, do it because they're not aware of where they are and where kind of their limbs are in relation to other things. And so that asks kind of an interesting question about proprioception, why it's different in people with, I guess what's functioning differently in people with Parkinson's than in kind of children that have proprioception issues.
Yeah.
You see?
I get what you're saying. So there's
I guess
the
different
sense
symptoms of the same problem.
the running into walls problem is complex because it can either be you don't have a good sense of your own body,
Mhm.
or you don't have a good sense of what's going on in the environment,
Right.
or that relationship. So it's multifaceted. Whereas, I guess the baby example would can also be that. Yeah, I'm not an expert on the proprioceptive impairments.
I have not seen good literature, and Beth might know more of this, good literature about body awareness in Parkinson's versus something else. No one is doing that kind of research. It's a hard thing to measure objectively in the lab. But there is, so for the literature in dance in Parkinson's, right, which dance does improve your sense of attention, body awareness can really help with other kinds of tasks. You might infer that there's probably something going on.
So very quickly, secondary cognitive task. Is there like a measurement of that? Like if it's like like removing a pen cap versus playing chess, obviously like.
Yeah, I can't quote the study off the top of my head, but my guess is that it's the degree to which that secondary cognitive task requires concentration is going to scale with the likelihood that it will increase fall probability as well as probability of freezing. So,
Did you just call that dual tasking issues?
yeah, so you'll hear dual tasking as just, so secondary implies that one is more important. Dual tasking is just about doing two things simultaneously. So that's a more general phrase that encompasses this issue. Okay, so related to this issue of falls is what
But if we know the types of things, the types of secondary cognitive tasks that are causing or facilitating falls, that could be helpful for us trying to understand or develop tasks.
Beth would probably talk more about that, right, or no?
Just for working with people. Yeah, I mean, the unfortunate thing is that in the literature, in research, commonly what is done is having someone count backwards from 100 by sevens, which is like, you know, we've talked about to make it more ecologically valid, why don't you have somebody texting or trying to get their phone and talk on the phone while they're walking? But the research has not been really, I don't think really ecologically valid in that sense. So that's been commonly tasks that are used, multiplication, things like that. But sometimes performing a secondary motor task, but primarily it's a motor task, and then the secondary task is some kind of calculation or.
So for us in designing a VR interactive environment, we will have to look at what has been done, which is not going to be ecologically valid, like
No.
I said, and actually think of things that are more applicable as secondary tasks.
Yeah.
You can even call them that, right? But that's not well described in what I've seen.
It's like, yeah, that's inspire lesson design.
Yes, absolutely.
I think an important area of the literature to explore there is really when we talk about complexity, what we're interested in understanding is how much of the brain is engaged in this other task. So looking at, there are plenty of studies in sort of learning and behavior using neuroimaging, aside from the motor side, but to understand how much engagement there is in different brain areas as you scale task complexity. So that would be a good area of literature to explore.
And if you're thinking about what James is talking about and what Giselle talked about last week and this issue with automaticity, again, these systems are smart so that you don't need to be thinking about how it's working, right? Now you have Parkinson's disease where you're losing this automatic function, and now this is why people have more trouble with dual tasking, because they're using cognitive control to just walk. Now you add on top of that a secondary cognitive task, and they're going to be much worse than somebody who is relying on more automatic processes for just the walking task.
Is there any type of measurement of like how much conscious liberation is going on for people with Parkinson's, like when they, because like then you could balance out like how much more cognitive load.
Yeah, so this is like looking at dual task interference studies. So you basically have somebody perform a motor task, you measure their performance. You have someone do the cognitive task alone, measure the performance, and then you look at how the performance on both changes when combined. So that gives you a measure of
Dual task costs.
Yeah, dual task costs. It gives you sort of like how much reserve do you have, right? I could be really good at a motor task, and you give me the cognitive task, and I could still be just as good when those are combined. If I have a lot of reserve. But if I don't, then one of them, I have to prioritize. That's what I'm saying. So you can prioritize either.
Wouldn't
People will do that.
Wouldn't it be interesting to have a feedback system so you could know when you were getting overloaded?
Yes. So,
It could actually work for normal brains as well.
Well, there is no such thing as normal, unfortunately, when it comes to dual tasking, right? When we're tired eventually, we're sleepless, we all have experiences of decline in performance of all of these things.
But there must be a measure of when you get to that point where there's a
It's not
decline.
the same for each person,
No.
because, depending on your connectivity, you will fatigue differently. Each person will show their deterioration of performance in different ways.
But I mean, I would agree with you that even if we had an average, that would still indicate something.
Yeah, or some chemical difference or level or electrical activity or blood flow or something.
Well, or maybe if you could figure out what your baseline is and then be able
That's
to
different.
also.
So,
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah.
So
Yeah, well,
you
that's
have
what I was
that
just-
baseline.
Yeah, if you know how you operate, then you could have a sensor that tells you if you're operating on a lower level, and you might be able to adjust for it.
Get up in the morning, you can't tie your shoes, that's the problem.
Right.
You can tie them
No,
before.
but if you could do this, according to this research, you could actually reduce falls. Because you could sort of get a beep that says, wait a minute, you're doing a secondary task that's reducing your ability to cognitively control whatever it is you're doing.
It's useful in mild impairment, unfortunately in like moderate to severe impairment, you probably can't process the feedback. Because it's just
Well,
one more level of information. It's
yeah.
useful for someone else, but maybe
Yeah.
not you.
Uh-huh.
All right.
So,
How are we doing on time?
yeah,
It's
so I think I
2:43.
need to wrap up here in about 5 minutes.
Okay.
Um,
And
and
then
I
we can
can,
take a break and then set up that.
so, yeah, and I find this interesting because again, when people talk about locomotion and Parkinson's, almost universally, the first thing people will mention is freezing the gait. And again, this is at least from this review, from my understanding, is that over a short period of time, freezing of gait is not all that common in people with Parkinson's. So it can be a hard thing to study because it doesn't occur as much as you would assume it does based on, I think, common conversation. However, some of the triggers for freezing are very similar to what I mentioned on the last slide for fall. So turning, crossing thresholds, doorways, obstacles, like Marantina mentioned, passageways, unexpected stimuli, and so on. And so then, interestingly, people have looked at solutions for freezing. So how do you break people out of freezing episodes? And a lot of the literature focuses on cueing. So giving people a visual cue, so having things like stripes, right? So if there are stripes perpendicular to your path of motion, that can help reduce the prevalence of freezing. Stairs, which I sort of personally group in that same visual cueing domain because you have this pattern stimulus. Or even a lot of people have been exploring rhythmic auditory cueing. So you can imagine a lot of the work that people are doing now is if you can sense when someone's freezing, you can provide them with some sort of rhythmic auditory cue to try and get it. But I don't know how well that's worked in practice.
Would that help get them out any faster than they naturally get out? Because I thought I read something that said it doesn't last very long.
The rhythmic cueing?
No, freezing.
No.
No.
It does last long?
Oh, yeah.
Oh, I thought,
And you can get out of it and then go right. I mean, what doesn't last long is actually not freezing.
The
Oh, I see.
effect
Oh, okay.
of
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, so it's a hard problem, but as a scientist or neuroscientist, I think it's important to think about what are the common features of these triggers, both for falls and freezing, and the solutions. What does this tell you about maybe the source of the problem?
Well, it seems like the source of the problem is kind of cognitive overload or having to be flexible with changing what you're doing. So, for example, if you're turning, all of a sudden you have to be doing something differently. It seems like it's we were talking about this last week with executive functioning.
Cognitive flexibility.
There we go.
So
It seems like
section-
that's the problem.
Yeah, so changing from doing one thing to another. So that's, I think, explains turning fairly well.
Mm-hmm.
What about
Well, and crossing
these
thresholds,
three
obstacles.
what's sort of the stimulus here in these?
You sort of have to-
Joining, attention joining, crossing, obstacles, and
sort of about getting used to a new reality.
Yeah, so this is about, the way that I look at this is a sensation, right? This is a sensory issue. Well, it's a sensory trigger. It's something in the environment that's visual that is actually triggering the problem. So whereas, those of us who are
Perception processing.
yeah, so you're processing the sensory information and then perhaps making a decision that you don't normally do. So we see this. We would see these obstacles or passageways or doorways, and we don't process them. Right? We just walk through just so. So this is perhaps an issue of actually improperly processing visual information from the body. I just find it really interesting that the solution is can also be visual. So that's a little bit of a paradox.
No, but it's predictable. There's no sort of, in these things when you turn, so now you have a whole new context to get used to, or when you cross a threshold, there's now a new room or new something else, and obstacles, I guess, they're not usually there. So you have to sort of figure out, you have to deal with a new context.
Yeah, so it's sort of like, you can think of these as, in field of motor learning, we often talk about errors, which are really things that are unexpected. So maybe that's in line with what you're saying.
I mean, to me, what it says, if the pattern visual cueing or visually auditory cueing resolves these, there is some level of planning to get to a place that all of a sudden we can't make, and breaking it down into smaller pieces, which the cueing will give you, like this breadcrumbing, allows you to do without thinking about it, versus, something that's far away or new or whatever, and you just all of a sudden don't know how to deal with it.
Yeah, so I think it's really important, again, getting to the VR issue, right? If these things are largely visual or auditory, but they're sensory stimuli, I just find it very interesting that you can use sort of the same pathway to get people from something that is maybe more cognitive, relying on executive functioning decision making, to something that's more automatic. But
For us, it would be very fun to experiment with these things in VR, because it's the only place you can experiment with these things.
So when you cue the auditory inputs, right, you then overcome the visual changes, for example, like when there's a visually.
yeah, that's a good. So I'm not actually sure. So if there's a visually triggered freezing, can you get people out with an auditory stimulus? I'm not sure. You've never been to that.
See, I think another way to look at it, and kind of a flip side to look at it, is that people are freezing when they have more severe disease. That's why you're not seeing it with everyone who's seen it early on. People get to a certain point after so many years of having Parkinson's disease where they have something called motor complications, where their drugs just kick out and they can't move, basically. And that's when you're going to see freezing. So there's an interaction with disease severity and these kinds of things. But the brain is remarkable in that it compensates for loss automatically. Nobody really has to teach that. And so when you're losing these automatic processes in Parkinson's disease, what's happening is you're relying on more cognitive processing for things like avoiding an obstacle, making a turn. These are things that are normally, we plan in advance going through the door and then we run it off automatically. Now I'm utilizing those same cognitive processes for just moving. And as James said, and now I'm using cueing, which is actually taxing that system even more. So bottom line is, I think that what I would like to argue is that there is more automaticity that people with Parkinson's disease are capable of, that the system automatically adjusts to utilizing what works the best, which is cognitive processes for movement. Does that make sense? I would like to see us actually try to resolve some of these problems by challenging that automatic system, but not by using, lines on the floor. And I actually think, I don't know if that makes sense, but I actually think some of these problems are because it's natural for people with Parkinson's disease to rely on prefrontal, areas of the brain for movement. And that's why you see, I don't know.
So if I understand, because I understand what you said, and it makes a lot of sense. But when you say then pattern visual cueing or rhythmic auditory cueing are automatic processes.
No, that's just a crouch.
No, you
Right,
get,
but
you can
but what
get
I'm saying
someone
is
to
that
take a step by saying, step over that line.
oh
They
that's what you mean by
they're
cueing.
not-
No, you
it's
can't
not-
just run
no,
a rhythmic auditory
No.
cue and that will stop it from happening.
correct.
Oh, okay, that
And
makes
they'll
sense.
step over the line and then freeze again.
Oh, okay, I see.
So
Or-
it's a conscious response to an external cue.
So you have to think the gate is not the gate freezing, right? Freezing is an adaptive response to having to think harder about your next step, right? It's not the thing that happens unconsciously. It's like you're stopping because you have to really think about how to move next.
But so when you cue somebody though, aren't you taking away, you're focusing them on that and sort of removing some of the other blocks possibly?
You might get
But I think you're still relying on the same processes.
Yeah.
You're shifting, but it's still coming up with a solution for a movement that has to do with a cognitive trigger. I mean, that's not a word, but
You're making a decision.
Right.
Patrick?
Yeah, just sorry, quick. Do children, you said children keep falling. Do children freeze when they're learning to walk?
When they encounter something new sometimes, when they have their WTF moment, you see that.
So it's not like
It's not the same.
And some of the most remarkable things you see with Parkinson's disease, like this one client, I see one client, and she freezes. She cannot move. She gets to stairs and she goes bounding up the stairs without any problem. So I think it's triggering some kind of automatic response.
Yeah, and that's what's so confusing to me, right? Is that you can explain the effects of these to me, and it's my interpretation, that sometimes you can explain them as a cognitive, like you're taking advantage essentially of the fact that people are relying on cognitive strategies by giving them a cue that they sort of decide to respond to. So that's maybe one explanation. But then the stairs example, people use bicycle riding as well,
Right.
where it seems to just happen automatically. It's unclear to me whether that is also just, okay, oh, those are stairs. I know I just walk upstairs, right? This high-level thing, or something that's more automatic, right? Where the actual visual stimulus bypasses the cognitive machinery and goes directly to locomotion. So, in another, again, how I got into this area is looking at the effects of optic flow, so just pure visual stimuli on locomotion. And you can drive locomotion from a pure visual stimulus. So that suggests
I
that,
think those are different.
yeah,
Yeah,
they're
they do.
different explanations. And maybe they're both. So this is neuroscience. So maybe they're both happening in different situations.
It just seems like the world is offering different affordances. And like, they have to just acknowledge that that's a staircase before I can go up it. And once they understand, it's like if I wanted to open a door and for a second I didn't understand what a doorknob was, and then I figure it out, and then I just do it fluidly. Is that the comparison here?
So
I
are
don't
you
know.
just missing some intermediate step before
very
moving
interesting to
forward,
look at.
is what you're saying?
Yeah, is the world not disclosing itself as it should?
Yeah.
I mean, I guess maybe that's part of it, but again, from my perspective, thinking about the effects of visual stimuli, so just the visual perception that you are moving through your environment and trigger locomotion. So there's not so much, you're not necessarily recognizing affordance of, it's not that stimulus isn't allowing you to do something.
So there's no stimulus at all.
It could also be, think about it as overthinking, because you are in a state of overthinking because you're so cognitively focused at that stage of disease. So in other words, it's not so much that you maybe don't know what to do, it's just that maybe you're thinking about all the things you can do, right, all at once, and you can't prioritize. Like there's too many options, and with the brain, those hierarchies, in creating automatic behaviors, and therefore if everything is flattened out, it's impossible to decide what to do next. That's a possibility. I don't think we really know this,
Well,
but
I think well, Giselle would say that that's probably more the case.
possible.
Because she'll actually, when she sees patients in the clinic, she will actually get them out of freezing states by having them count backwards from 100 by 7. Because she doesn't want them thinking
Yes.
about their movement.
Yes.
She wants them just not thinking about it.
So
So it's like,
hypnotizing them.
again,
a
I
little
mean,
bit.
it's all flipped around.
Yeah.
Yes. So that's why the stairs could have this hypnotizing
Right.
effect, right, or the cubes, and that's, again, we can experiment with this stuff
Right.
as a content.
Right, that's the,
And I think trying to and the way that I like to look at these types of questions is don't ask the is it A or B question. Right?
yeah,
The question is under what conditions does A occur, under what conditions does B occur?
Yeah.
Could it also be both interacting in some strange way? So if you think about the scientific question that way, then you can actually start to do really cool experiments where you can, if you can dissociate these things, then you've really helped us understand what's going on. That's what I think is exciting. Aside from the intervention side, the understanding the system part. But I'm going to stop there. Bottom line from all of this is, in Parkinson's, as well as other diseases, there are multiple problems, right? So it's not just a basal ganglia issue, but because we're dealing with this complex network, there are changes at different nodes in the network. The cerebellum, there's change in the brainstem, prefrontal areas, and all of these areas are involved in the control of walking. So I think it's important to think about that problem from a more broad perspective when we're trying to develop interventions. Ultimately, what we're dealing with is how can we make changes to the brain in order to improve behavior. And that's where Beth will pick up with neuroplasticity.
Thank you.
That's great, thanks.
All right. We're going to take a 10-minute break or so, and I will set up Beth. Beth, are you okay with broadcasting?
oh, yeah,
All right.
yes.